Hey there, self-care warriors. Welcome back to Self-Care Haven. So I noticed that there were videos popping up about borderline personality disorder, and I thought it would be a perfect time to revisit this topic on my channel. So if you watched my mental health news radio interview in January, you'll notice that one of the questions I answered was, what are the differences between borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder? Actually, in one of my classes, the adult personality and psychopathology one, I actually had to do a presentation on borderline personality disorder. And I wanted to talk about some of the things that I learned, especially regarding the differences between these two disorders, because I think it's not really spoken of in a way that's accessible, in a way that refers back to the literature on the topic, and in a way that actually pertains to real clients with Bpd versus Npd. So let's talk about this. So the first difference that I find is that the degree of empathy that Npd people experience is incredibly low versus Bpd people. They still have the capacity for empathy. It's not that they lack it, it's not that they can't access it if they try and if they are able to put aside their own emotions in order to see the other person's perspective and to consider another person's emotional states. There's actually been research that shows that Bpd individuals are actually even more discriminating of people's mental states, more so than people without Bpd. That's probably because they have such strong emotions that they're able to recognize other people's emotions very quickly and very easily. Whereas Npd people, they tend to be very shallow when it comes to emotions. They feel a sense of emotional numbness. They don't have as much access to their emotions except for the emotion of rage, of course, and perhaps their sadistic pleasure in getting supply in whatever way they can. And while Bpd individuals and Npd individuals both share in the similar symptoms of being very, very interpersonally exploitative and manipulative, they both have a chronic sense of emptiness, they both need excessive amounts of attention and validation from the world, and they both experience excessive rage. Bpd individuals have intense experiences of other emotions aside from rage. So while the narcissistic individual usually experiences narcissistic rage as one of their dominant emotions, Bpd individuals can experience a full range of emotions, and they are able to experience a great deal of remorse and guilt for their rages, whereas a person who is exhibiting narcissistic rage, they may not feel as much guilt, they may not feel remorse, they will never take accountability for their actions, and while Bpd individuals may also not take accountability for their actions, they may still come to terms with the fact that they did something wrong. They may still feel guilty about it, and their rage, I would say, is a little bit more disassociative than narcissistic rage. Narcissistic rage tends to be motivated by a need for control and power, whereas the rage of a Bpd individual is very disassociative, it's very impulsive, and impulsivity is one of the main characteristics of their disorder. They also tend to be a lot more into self-harm versus an Npd individual who is more out to harm others in order to gain a sense of supply and sadistic pleasure. Whereas Bpd individuals, they may still manipulate people, they may still hurt them. Sometimes they do hurt people intentionally, and sometimes they don't hurt people intentionally. Of course, the outcome is still hurtful and damaging, there's no doubt about that. But it's a little less malicious, I would say, than a person with Npd or antisocial personality disorder. Now, I'm not trying to invalidate anyone who's been in a relationship with a borderline personality disorder who feels like they experienced intentional malice. What I am saying is that this population tends to come from backgrounds of trauma. In fact, Pete Walker talks about how many people with complex PTSD are actually misdiagnosed as borderline. So there's a lot of confusion among the different disorders. There's some people who say that maybe all the personality disorders are misdiagnoses of complex PTSD. Again, this is still a very new area of research, I feel, and there's still so much more to be learned in terms of all the cluster B disorders and their differences and their nuances and their similarities. But I just want to share this type of information because I think that a lot of us get caught up with, and this is good, like it's great to share our personal experiences, but I think that it also can turn into a debate where it's very confusing, and it confuses a lot of the differences between these disorders, and then people start to apply their own personal experiences. And while personal experience can be a very, very good area of knowledge, it's definitely a very valuable resource. What it can do is that it can kind of distract us from the main distinctions and the similarities between the two, and then people get really confused about the motives, the intentions of people with these two different disorders, and then they start to kind of brandish a generalization of these two disorders, and they start to use them interchangeably. And I think it can be a little bit confusing when we do that, because then we're saying that BPD individuals are just as sadistic as NPD individuals, and that's not necessarily the case. BPD individuals tend to experience more dissociative rage. They tend to come from backgrounds of trauma, whereas with NPD individuals, we still don't have a verdict as to what caused their trauma, or what caused their disorder, I should say. There's been research studies that show that overvaluation, spoiling the child, teaching the child a sense of entitlement has caused NPD, whereas with BPD, it seems like the majority of clients do have some sort of history of trauma. So it's very interesting to consider those different those distinctions. And again, we don't know too much about NPD as much as we should, because this is an understudied population. So this is something that's going to take a lot more than just one YouTube video to talk about. It's going to take probably decades of research in the future to understand what's going on here. And I also think there's like a gender bias between BPD and NPD, because I think that female narcissists are definitely probably more misdiagnosed as borderlines, because we have that stereotype in society about women being hysterical and emotional, and narcissistic rage from a female may be interpreted by a clinician as more of a borderline trait than if a male came in and raged, because male rage does tend to be more acceptable in society. So those are some things to think about. Another difference I would point out is that a person who has BPD has a different motivation for manipulating people usually than a person with NPD. A person with NPD has the motivation of trying to control others, trying to gain supply from others, and to fulfill their own, unique agenda. A person with BPD has this chronic sense of emptiness, loneliness. They're always seeking validation from others, and they're always seeking to feel loved, to feel as if they're not going to be abandoned, because that's one of their biggest fears, is to be abandoned. And as I said in my interview, while BPD individuals are more likely to fear abandonment, NPD individuals are most likely to be doing the abandoning. So it's very interesting how these two disorders, they overlap in many ways, but then there's also a lot of distinctions between them. And perhaps most importantly, a distinction I would like to bring up is their differences in responsiveness to treatment. As you know, there are actually mental health professionals who won't even treat narcissistic personality disorder people, because they don't think that they can treat them. They don't feel like this is a disorder that can be cured or changed. Now, there's lots of differences in opinions about this, so I don't want to get into that debate right now, but it's interesting how even within the mental health community there is reluctance about people with NPD. And with borderline personality disorder, it is a very difficult disorder to treat, but I would say that right now it has a little bit more hope because of people like Marshall Lenehan, who developed DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is more of a mindfulness type therapy that combines mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy techniques together in order to teach BPD individuals interpersonal effectiveness, how to stand up for yourself, assertiveness skills, and also a lot about boundaries and just core skills that if you don't have BPD, you may not have as much trouble with, but if you do have it or you have complex PTSD, misdiagnosed as BPD, you may have to use that kind of therapy in order to learn those types of core skills. And DBT has been effective. DBT has been effective for borderline personality disorders. So as long as the individual is willing to get treatment, and I think that's what really causes this clash between mental health professionals and people with narcissistic personality disorder, because people with NPD tend to manipulate the therapist. They tend to say that they're going to change, but they don't. They tend to fool couples therapists and triangulate them with their client, with their partner, because they have no agenda or initiative to want to change. That motivation is not within them. They're not rewarded by the idea of change. They don't feel the need to change. That's intrinsic to their disorder. And that's why it's so much more difficult, I feel, in my opinion, to treat someone with NPD versus BPD. Because I think with a BPD individual, there is a part of them that wants to change just because they don't want to lose anybody in their lives. They do really fear abandonment. And I'm not trying to take away, again, accountability for the behaviors of any person, whether they have a disorder or not, because as the National Domestic Violence Hotline says, mental illness does not cause abuse. The abuser causes abuse. The abuser has the choice to abuse. The abuser has the ability to switch their mask, the ability to consciously try to change themselves. And if they're not in a state of psychosis, if they're not suffering from something like schizophrenia, if they're not suffering from an illness that basically takes away all accountability for their actions and all mental capacity in order to act in a certain way. Again, and this is something that actually Shrinking Violet talked about. She talked about the distinction between mental illness and a personality disorder, and I think that's a great distinction. I think that is something that we need to talk about, because I don't think that these personality disorders necessarily mean that the person is not accountable for their actions. Again, as I talked about in many of my videos, I don't think that the majority of abusers are doing this unconsciously. I definitely think there's enough evidence from the experts who've actually worked with abusers and from, abuse survivors' accounts that abusers do this intentionally. They do know what they're doing. They do it with malice. Now, with BPD individuals, it might not be as malicious as NPD individuals, but I don't think that takes away their accountability. I don't think that means that they shouldn't get treatment. I don't think that it gives them a free pass to abuse. I don't think anyone really gets a free pass to abuse. I think everyone should get treatment if they need it, and they should work on themselves, and if they feel like they can change, then they should go out and try to change. And they should try to change the abusive behavior that's harming a lot of people. And it's not, as Shrinking Violet says, that's not about stigma, that's about the truth. And the truth is that if you have a disorder, you should get treatment. And I'm not saying that it's easy to change. I'm not saying that it's going to be a piece of cake. It's not going to be a piece of cake. It's going to be probably a lifelong struggle. But if you are working to change yourself, and if you are willing to change, and if you have the resources to change, by all means, go out and do it. And you're not only going to be a better person for it, but you're also going to change the world at the same time, because now your contribution can be even more mindful, and now the way you behave towards others will be more mindful, and now everyone else around you will benefit. And this is not about stigma. It's just about being a better person. And disorder or no disorder, we should all strive to be better than where we currently are. We all have flaws, we all have challenges, we all have difficulties. I'm not saying that, people with personality disorders have less difficulties than a person who doesn't have a personality disorder. Obviously, they have a little bit more challenges to work with if they want to change, but I don't think that that should excuse their behavior, their abusive behavior. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that there is a distinction between BPD and NPD. There is a distinction behind the motivations, behind the interpersonal exploitation. There is a difference in the way that they both experience emotions, and there are differences in the way that they respond to treatment. So there really needs to be more research done on both disorders, especially NPD, I feel, because there hasn't been enough people with NPD who really seek out treatment, so it's very hard to study this type of population. But those are just my thoughts. I want to hear your perspectives. Have you met people with NPD? Have you met people with BPD? Were you not sure? Let me know your thoughts below. And again, I'm not going to try to say that nobody's accountable for their abusive behavior. I believe that people are accountable for their abusive behavior, disorder or no disorder. I'll leave the article about the National Domestic Hotline, their website, and their article about how mental illness does not necessarily excuse abusive behavior. And so you guys can read it, because I think that while mental illness can exacerbate abusive behavior and perhaps make it more likely, it doesn't excuse abusive behavior when the abuser is able to switch masks so quickly and they're able to control their behavior in public. That's one of the key things for me. If they can't control their behavior in public, then there might be something deeper going on, that it is incredibly unconscious and incredibly reflexive, and maybe a sign of their mental state not being controllable. But otherwise, if they are able to control that behavior in public, they can, with enough effort and work and resources and support, they can work to change that behavior towards the people that they love or claim to love. So I hope this video helps in talking more about the similarities as well as the differences between BPD and NPD. Share your experiences below, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Until then, take care.